All right, well, after a very long and boring sermon, the parishioners filed out of the church saying nothing to the preacher. That's a really bad sign. And toward the end of the line was a thoughtful person who always commented on the sermons. Ministers really love that, you know. And she said, "Pastor, today your sermon reminded me of the peace and the love of God." And the pastor was thrilled. "No one has ever said anything like that about my preaching before. Tell me why." "Well," the parishioner began, "it reminded me of the peace of God because it passed all understanding, and the love of God because it endured forever." So I know this is the first time you're here to meet me, and I promise I won't be that long-winded, even though I'm really excited about this topic today. So again, welcome, and we are continuing our series on Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. And last week, Edie Crane spoke and shared with us what happens when we feel shame and how we armor ourselves, how we guard ourselves when we start to feel vulnerable. And she reminded us about these things called gremlins. Gremlins, those limiting beliefs, also known as the lies that we tell ourselves, that we sometimes believe that are definitely not true. And she gave us some great tools to work with those gremlins. And the one that really jumped out at me was prayer. Prayer. Prayer, what Unity teaches, is our conscious connection with all that we are. And to remember that we're always connected. Folks, we're never disconnected to that which we are. We can't be. But prayer is that activity that reminds us of the truth of what we are. And how powerful a tool that can be when we confront what we sometimes still hold from our past as shame. When some things come up for us that feel like we're not enough, that we're unworthy, that prayer is that powerful tool that can bring us back to center, isn't it? Yes. So, this week we're talking about minding the gap. Now, the origin of that statement apparently came from the London subway from the 1960s. I see some heads shaking yes, they know that. That apparently, here you are on the station platform, and you're getting ready to step into the train, and there's a gap there. Mind the gap. It would not be a fun experience, right, to put our foot in that and try to enter the train. And so from that, it's gained popularity. There's apparently a pop rock band named Mind the Gap. There's a blog. There's a movie. Apparently lots of London t-shirts have Mind the Gap and postcards. So it's gained notoriety. However, let's look at it from the context of daring greatly. What does it mean to mind the gap? So minding the gap is about paying attention, right? Even in this original context, is paying attention, being aware, being conscious. Minding the gap. And so in the context here of this conversation, Brene Brown says, what are our values? Are we aware of our values? So she talks about the distinction of aspirational values and practiced values. And she invites us to take a look at what are our aspirational values? What do we aspire to be? You know, corporations, churches, communities have core values often, don't they? What are your core values? Examples being honesty, integrity, kindness, love, compassion. Maybe those are some of yours. All right, so the opportunity we have in this conversation is to look at what are our aspired values and what are our practiced values. Is there a gap? Is there a gap in what we say we want to do and be and express, and what we're actually doing and being and expressing? So I found a story about that I wanted to share with you this morning. Apparently there was a man being tailgated. That never happens here. Being tailgated by a stressed out woman on a busy boulevard when suddenly the light turned yellow just in front of him. And he did the right thing and stopped, even though he could have beaten the red light by accelerating through the intersection. Well, the tailgating woman hit the roof and the horn. I know none of you have ever done this. Screaming and cursing in frustration as she missed her chance to get through the intersection. And as she was still in mid-rant, she heard a tap on her window and looked up into the face of a very serious police officer. The officer ordered her to exit her car with her hands up. He took her to the police station where she was searched, fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a holding cell. After several hours, a policeman approached the cell and opened the door. She was escorted back to the booking desk where the arresting officer was waiting with her personal effects. He said, "Ma'am, I'm very sorry for this mistake. You see, I pulled up behind your car while you were blowing your horn, flipping off the guy in front of you, and cussing a blue streak at him. I noticed the John 3:16 license plate, the What Would Jesus Do bumper sticker, the Follow Me to Sunday School bumper sticker, and the chrome-plated Christian fish emblem on the trunk. Naturally, I assumed you had stolen the car." I think there's a gap somewhere. So the opportunity that we have this morning is to ask ourselves, are we walking our talk? Are we walking our talk? Brene Brown says this: minding the gap is paying attention to the space between where we are actually standing and where we want to be. So where we're standing, meaning the consciousness we are currently expressing and the consciousness we want to be expressing. And so let me throw a little Unity teaching in here. Unity teaches life is consciousness. Doesn't it? Have you heard that? Life is consciousness. What is consciousness? Consciousness is the sum total of all that we believe and think, do and express. So our life is an expression and manifestation of our consciousness. So when we're minding the gap, we're paying attention to how we are actually thinking and feeling and acting and being in relationship to how we want to be thinking and feeling and acting and being. And there's a couple of examples that we can absolutely point to in the outer world And I can't believe I'm bringing these up because these are two topics that, I don't know about you, I avoid at any party and family gathering. Politics and religion. But really, we're not going to go too far into that. But I think that we can look at, sometimes in politics, that we get excited about a candidate and they share with us, during the campaign, what they aspire to be and aspire to do, and we get all excited, and then all of a sudden they're in office, and sometimes those things don't happen. Or there's a religious leader or religious tradition that says we are loving, we are inclusive, we are welcoming. And sometimes when we go to those communities, maybe we don't feel that way. And so what we have an opportunity to do in this conversation is to look at how other people's choices impact our choice to engage or connect or disengage or disconnect. See, the consequence of sometimes of experiencing or witnessing values that are not in alignment. Someone declares they're about something and they don't seem to be acting that way, is that we'll disengage. We'll disconnect. And we might just want to ask, you might just want to do your own exploration of where have I stepped away from connecting? Where have I stepped away from engaging? Maybe voting is difficult for you now. I don't know. This is just for you to search your heart. If you're disillusioned with politics, or maybe you have stepped away from a community, an organization. Maybe you've stepped away from a relationship. And the opportunity is to become conscious. Conscious, because I think sometimes, obviously we know, we've stepped away from something. But sometimes I've heard people say, I don't really know why. It just didn't feel right anymore. I just stepped away. The opportunity is to look at, could it be that the aspired values are not what's being practiced? And then we're at choice, see. We're at choice about whether we want to step back in, possibly and engage and call those values forth. Because what we know is that we're never a victim, right? We can make conscious choices. And then the opportunity is for us to go even deeper and to do our own self-inquiry, to ask ourselves that question, where am I out of alignment with my values? There's an adage that I've heard for years. Who you are speaks so loudly, I can't hear what you're saying. Who you are speaks so loudly, I cannot hear what you're saying. Folks, how we show up says volumes. It says volumes. And I'm going to say that what we are is what matters. I make a distinction because unity teaches that the what of us is the divinity that we are, that is unchanging. The who of us is the personality self. The personality self that sometimes forgets what we are. And I'm going to say what we are speaks so loudly. That's what we say yes to expressing through being aware of what matters to us, what values are we aligning with in our own lives. There's one more story that Brene Brown shared that I just thought was so important for us to hear because we can relate to it whether we're a parent or not. Apparently a mom, as a way to establish ground rules in her family, had a conversation with her children. And she said, folks, we need to talk here because we need to lay some ground rules about our values. That stealing and cheating would never be tolerated, and that honesty and integrity are the family's highest values. So one day, her children are with her, and she goes to the grocery store, and she gets in her car, and she's looking over her receipt, and she notices that the store forgot to charge her for something. And her response was, well, they charged too much anyway. It wasn't my fault. So what do the children hear? A conflicted message, right? Well, okay, I know we can be hard on this mom, but who knows? This mom could have been really stressed and really tired after taking her children to soccer practice and dance, whatever. But it seems like that we can relate. Because the thing is, sometimes we're just not on our game. We're just not. It's okay. And the opportunity is to be aware and to make it right when we can. Because this mom could really make a powerful impact on her children by going to them and saying, guys, you know that day, I wasn't exactly modeling what I have asked you to do. And I'm going to go back and I'm going to make it right. So, Brene Brown says minding the gap is about daring greatly because it calls us to be aware of the values that we hold and to be honest with ourselves when we're not standing in them. And folks, that honesty calls us up to be vulnerable, doesn't it? Vulnerable and to embrace shame, resilience, because I don't know about you, but when I'm not living up to my values, oh, those gremlins like to rear their heads. Yeah. So, they sneak up, but don't buy in. So remember, we don't have to be perfect. We are inherently perfect. But we don't have to be perfect when it comes to expressing our aspired values, but just to be willing, to be conscious, to engage, to connect, to make conscious choices as best we can. So this week, will you join me in practicing self-awareness at a deeper level? Will you join me? Yes. All right. Being an observer of yourself, spending time in the quiet, because how will we be aware of ourselves if we're not conscious, if we're not awake, if we're not grounded, if we can't see ourselves? One of the greatest tools that we can develop is self-observation. And it can happen. You're standing in your workplace and you're standing across from someone that might just, trigger you. And in that moment of self-awareness, you can make another choice. You can make another choice. Yeah. And I invite you also this week to reflect on these questions. What are my aspired values? What are my aspired values? And am I living in alignment with them? Honestly. And the third thing, please be gentle with yourself. Love yourself through this exploration, because it's not about beating yourself up, folks. It's about discovering more and more of who you are and what you really want to express. Are you with me? Yes. Wonderful. Let's affirm together. I mind the gap in my life and feel a renewed sense of connection, engagement, and worth. And so it is. And so it is.